The stars looked different through the viewing window of the horizon's edge. Captain Jake Morrison stood with his hands behind his back, watching the blue and green planet grow larger as their ship moved closer. After 6 months of traveling through space, they had finally reached Kepler 442b. This was the moment humanity had been waiting for. First contact with an alien species. Jake turned away from the window and walked down the metal hallway. His boots made soft sounds on the floor as he headed to the bridge. The ship was quiet except for the low hum of the engines. Most of the crew was still sleeping, but Jake had been awake for hours. He was too excited to sleep. The bridge doors opened with a soft hiss. Lieutenant Paul Wright was already there, checking the ship's systems. He looked up when Jake entered. "Good morning, Captain," Paul said. "All systems are running normally. We should reach orbit in about 3 hours." Jake nodded and sat in his captain's chair. "Have you contacted Dr. Baker yet?" "She's already awake and preparing her equipment," Paul replied. "She seems very excited about making contact." Dr. Lisa Baker was the ship's xenobiologist. She had spent years studying what little information they had about the aliens on this planet. The humans called them Zephyrians because their radio signals had a musical quality that reminded people of gentle wind sounds. Jake pressed a button on his chair. "Dr. Baker, please report to the bridge." A few minutes later, Dr. Baker arrived. She was a tall woman with brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She carried a tablet computer and looked very alert despite the early hour. "Captain, I've been reviewing our communication protocols," she said. "The Zephyrians have been sending us mathematical sequences and basic images. I believe we can establish meaningful contact within a few hours of arriving. What do we know about them?" Jake asked Lisa. Looked at her tablet. "Based on their transmissions and our long-range scans, they appear to be peaceful. Their cities are built underground, which is unusual for a species with their level of technology. They seem to avoid the surface of their planet for some reason." Paul frowned. "That's strange. The planet looks beautiful from here. Lots of forests and clean water. Why would they hide underground?" "We'll find out soon enough," Jake said. "Dr. Baker, I want you to take the lead on all communications. Remember, we're here to learn and make friends, not to interfere with their way of life." 2 hours later, the horizon's edge entered orbit around the planet. The crew gathered on the bridge to get their first close look at their new world. Through the large viewing screen, they could see vast forests of red and purple trees. Strange creatures flew through the sky, and rivers sparkled like silver ribbons across the landscape. "It's beautiful," whispered Amy Watson, one of the younger crew members. "I can't wait to walk on the surface." Dr. Baker was already working at her communication station. She had detected the Zephyrian signals and was trying to respond using their mathematical language. After 20 minutes of careful work, she suddenly smiled. "Captain, I'm getting a response. They're acknowledging our signals and trying to establish a translation matrix." Over the next hour, the humans and Zephyrians worked together to build a basic language bridge. The aliens were clearly intelligent and patient. They sent simple pictures and words, building up from basic concepts to more complex ideas. Finally, Dr. Baker looked up from her station with excitement. "Captain, they want to meet us face to face. They're inviting a small group to visit their underground city." Jake felt his heart beat faster. This was it, humanity's first meeting with aliens. "Tell them we accept," he said. "Dr. Baker, you'll come with me. Lieutenant Wright, select 2 Marines to accompany us. We'll take a shuttle down to the surface." An hour later, their small shuttle broke through the planet's atmosphere. Jake piloted the craft toward the coordinates the Zephyrians had provided. As they flew over the forest, he noticed something odd. The trees were enormous, much larger than any trees on Earth. Some of them were as wide as city blocks and hundreds of feet tall. "Look at the size of everything," Dr. Baker said, staring out the window. "The plants, the animals we can see flying around. Everything is much bigger than we expected." They landed in a clearing near a hillside. Almost immediately, the ground began to move. What looked like solid earth opened up like a door, revealing a tunnel entrance. 3 figures emerged from the tunnel and walked toward the shuttle. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The Zephyrians were beautiful. They stood about 8 feet tall and looked somewhat like deer, but they walked upright on 2 legs. Their skin was pale blue and seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. Most striking of all were the crystal-like antlers growing from their heads. The antlers glowed with a soft, changing light that shifted from blue to green to purple. The lead Zephyrian stepped forward and made a gesture that seemed like a greeting. Dr. Baker activated her translation device and spoke slowly. "Hello, we are humans from the planet Earth. We come in peace." The translation device hummed for a moment, then produced musical sounds that the Zephyrians seemed to understand. The lead alien responded, and the device translated his words into English. "Welcome, travelers from the distant star. I am Counselor Veltar. We have waited long to meet others who journey between the stars." The first meeting went better than anyone had hoped. The Zephyrians were friendly and curious about humans. They led the small group into their underground city, which was amazing to see. The tunnels were wide and well lit by glowing crystals. The city itself was carved from rock but felt warm and alive. Thousands of Zephyrians came to see the humans. They were clearly excited but also seemed nervous. Dr. Baker noticed that they stayed in groups and often looked toward the ceiling, as if they were worried about something above them. During their first formal meeting, Counselor Veltar asked many questions about human society. He was particularly interested in what humans ate. When Dr. Baker explained that humans were omnivores who ate both plants and meat, the room became very quiet. "You consume other living creatures?" Veltar asked, his glowing antlers dimming slightly. "Yes," Dr. Baker replied honestly. "Humans eat many different foods. We eat plants, fruits, and meat from various animals." The Zephyrians began talking among themselves in quick, musical voices. Dr. Baker could see they were upset about something. "I'm sorry if this troubles you," she said. "We understand that different species have different diets." Veltar looked at the humans with what seemed like a mixture of fascination and fear. "Forgive us, friends from Earth. We are herbivores. We eat only plants. The idea of consuming other creatures is difficult for us to understand." "We respect your way of life," Captain Morrison said. "We would never ask you to change your customs." But Veltar shook his head. "It is not judgment we feel, Captain Morrison. It is something closer to awe. You see, our people have lived in fear for thousands of years. We hide underground because of the creatures that hunt on the surface." Dr. Baker leaned forward with interest. "What kind of creatures?" The counselor's antlers dimmed even more. "We call them shadow maws. They are the apex predators of our world. Massive, intelligent, and deadly beyond measure. They hunt in packs and can appear from shadows without warning. For millennia, they have kept our people trapped below ground." The humans exchanged glances. This explained why the Zephyrians lived underground despite their advanced technology. "These shadow maws," Jake said carefully. "How dangerous are they?" "Exactly." Veltar stood and walked to a wall covered in carved images. The pictures showed enormous, terrifying creatures with multiple arms, sharp claws, and glowing red eyes. "They are 12 feet tall and weigh more than your shuttle," he said quietly. "Their claws can cut through solid rock. They can phase partially through matter, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. No Zephyrian has survived a direct encounter with a Shadow Maw pack in over 300 years." Dr. Baker studied the carvings with growing understanding. These aliens had built their entire civilization around hiding from predators. No wonder they seemed so nervous and fearful. "That must be very difficult," she said gently. "Living with such constant fear." "It is all we have ever known," Veltar replied. "But now you come to us, creatures who hunt and consume other life forms without fear. We cannot help but wonder. What manner of beings are you humans, that you face the darkness without trembling?" 3 days had passed since the humans first met the Zephyrians. Captain Jake Morrison decided it was time to explore the surface of the planet. The Zephyrians had been kind hosts, but they refused to go above ground. Every time the humans mentioned surface exploration, the aliens became very nervous. Marine Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez was preparing his equipment in the shuttle bay. He was a strong man with dark hair and serious eyes. Carlos had been a soldier for 15 years and had seen combat on 3 different planets. But he had never seen aliens as scared as the Zephyrians. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Captain Morrison called as he entered the bay. "Are your Marines ready for surface patrol?" Carlos looked up from his rifle. "Yes, sir. Private Watson, Private Johnson, and Private Lee are all prepared. We have full combat gear and enough supplies for a 6-hour patrol." Amy Watson walked over carrying her backpack. She was young and eager, only 22 years old. This was her first mission off Earth, and she was excited to see an alien world up close. "Sergeant, do you really think we'll encounter these Shadowmaw creatures?" she asked. Carlos shrugged. Maybe not. But we need to be ready for anything. The Zephyrians are terrified of them, so they must be dangerous." Private Johnson and Private Lee joined them. Johnson was tall and thin, while Lee was short and stocky. Both men looked confident and alert. "Remember," Carlos told his team, "we're here to explore and gather information. We're not looking for trouble, but if trouble finds us, we handle it professionally." Dr. Richard Hayes appeared in the doorway. He was the ship's biologist and had been studying the Zephyrian data about the planet's ecosystem. He carried several collection containers and scientific instruments. "Mind if I join your patrol, Sergeant?" Dr. Hayes asked. "I'd like to collect some plant and soil samples," Carlos nodded. "Stay close to the group, Doc. Don't wander off." 20 minutes later, their shuttle landed in the same clearing they had used before. The Zephyrian tunnel entrance was closed and no aliens came out to greet them. Carlos knew the underground dwellers were watching from hidden cameras, but they would not risk coming to the surface. The forest was beautiful but strange. The red and purple trees stretched high above them, creating a canopy so thick that the sunlight came through in scattered beams. The air smelled sweet, like flowers and fresh earth. Strange bird-like creatures flew between the branches, calling to each other with musical sounds. "It's amazing," Amy whispered, looking around with wide eyes. "I can't believe they hide from all this beauty." Dr. Hayes was already collecting samples. He found plants unlike anything on Earth. Some flowers changed colors as he watched them. Others seemed to glow with their own inner light. "The biodiversity here is incredible," he said, carefully placing a soil sample in a container. "This planet has more species than we could study in 100 years. Carlos kept his team moving in a loose formation. They walked along what seemed to be an animal trail through the forest. The path was wide and well-worn, suggesting that large creatures used it regularly. After 2 hours of walking, they came to a clearing with a small stream running through it. The water was crystal clear, and strange fish with silver scales swam in the current. Dr. Hayes immediately knelt down to collect water samples. "This is a good place to rest," Carlos announced. "Everyone take a drink and check your equipment." Amy sat on a fallen log and opened her water bottle. The forest was peaceful and quiet except for the gentle sounds of the stream and the distant calls of flying creatures. She couldn't understand why the Zephyrians were so afraid of this place. "Sergeant?" Private Johnson called softly. "I'm seeing some large tracks here." Carlos walked over to where Johnson was pointing. In the soft earth near the stream, there were footprints unlike anything he had ever seen. They were huge, almost 2 feet long, with deep claw marks. The prints showed 6 toes with what looked like very sharp claws. Dr. Hayes came over to examine the tracks. "These are fresh," he said quietly. "Made within the last few hours." Carlos felt his stomach tighten. "The tracks were definitely from a large predator. Everyone stay alert. Whatever made these prints is big and dangerous." They continued their patrol, but now everyone was more careful. Carlos had his rifle ready, and the other Marines kept scanning the forest around them. Dr. Hayes still collected samples. But he stayed very close to the group. The attack came without warning. Amy was walking slightly ahead of the others when a shadow moved in the trees above them. She looked up just in time to see something huge dropping toward her. The creature was massive, with 6 arms ending in razor-sharp claws. Its hide looked like black armor, and its eyes glowed red like burning coals. "Shadow Maw!" Carlos shouted, raising his rifle. The creature landed between Amy and the rest of the team. It was even more terrifying than the Zephyrian carvings had shown. 12 feet tall and incredibly muscular, it moved with frightening speed despite its size. When it opened its mouth, Amy could see rows of teeth like daggers. Carlos opened fire immediately. His rifle sent bullets into the creature's armored hide, but they seemed to barely scratch it. The Shadow Maw turned toward him with a roar that shook the trees. "Spread out," Carlos ordered. "Don't let it corner us." Private Johnson and Private Lee moved to flank the creature while firing their weapons. The Shadow Maw spun toward them, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. One of its clawed arms swept through the air where Johnson had been standing a second before. Amy rolled behind a large tree, her heart pounding. She had never seen anything so frightening. The creature seemed to phase in and out of solid matter, becoming partially transparent as it moved. Sometimes the bullets passed right through it. Dr. Hayes crouched behind a boulder, clutching his sample containers. "Its body seems to shift between solid and energy states," he called out. "That's how it can phase through matter." Carlos was reloading his rifle when the Shadow Maw suddenly appeared right in front of him. One of its claws slashed down, catching him across the shoulder and throwing him backward into a tree. Blood soaked through his uniform. "Sergeant!" "Amy!" shouted. Private Lee threw a grenade at the creature. The explosion knocked the Shadow Maw back but didn't seem to seriously hurt it. Instead, it made the creature angry. Its red eyes blazed brighter, and it let out another bone-shaking roar, but then something unexpected happened. 2 more Shadow Maws emerged from the forest. They moved like ghosts between the trees, their forms shifting and changing as they approached. Carlos realized with horror that they were facing a pack. "Fall back to the shuttle," he ordered, struggling to his feet despite his injury. "Move now!" The team began a fighting retreat through the forest. The Shadow Maws followed them, sometimes solid and sometimes like shadows. They seemed to be playing with the humans, not attacking with full force. Amy realized they were being hunted for sport. Private Johnson stumbled over a root and fell hard. Before he could get up, one of the Shadow Maws was on him. Its claws raked across his leg and he screamed in pain. Carlos and Lee laid down covering fire while Amy helped Johnson to his feet. Dr. Hayes was running beside them, his scientific equipment forgotten. "They're hurting us," he gasped. "They're driving us in a specific direction." Carlos understood immediately. The Shadow Maws weren't just hunting randomly. They were using pack tactics like wolves on Earth. They were trying to drive the humans into a trap. "Change direction," he shouted. "Head for that rocky outcrop." The team turned sharply to the left, fighting their way through thick underbrush. The Shadow Maws followed, but Carlos could see they were confused by the sudden change in direction. Their pack strategy had been disrupted. They reached the rocky area and found a narrow canyon between 2 large boulders. Carlos pushed his team into the opening where the Shadow Maws couldn't surround them. "This won't hold them long," he said, breathing hard. "Johnson, can you call for pickup?" Johnson was working on his radio despite his injured leg. "Shuttle 2. This is ground team. We need immediate extraction. We are under attack by hostile creatures." The radio crackled with Captain Morrison's voice. "Ground team, we have your position. Shuttle is launching now. Hold your position for 6 minutes." 6 minutes felt like 6 hours. The Shadow Maws prowled around the rocky outcrop, testing for weaknesses. Sometimes they would phase partially through the stone walls, causing the humans to fire at what seemed like ghosts. The creatures were clearly intelligent, studying their prey and planning their next move. Amy was bandaging Carlos's shoulder when she noticed something strange. "Sergeant, look at their behavior. They're not just mindless predators." Carlos watched the creatures and realized she was right. The shadow maws were communicating with each other through low growls and body language. They were coordinating their attacks and sharing information about the humans' weapons and capabilities. "They're learning from us," he said quietly. "Every time we fire our weapons, they're figuring out how to counter them." Dr. Hayes was observing the creatures with scientific fascination despite the danger. Their ability to phase through matter seems to require concentration. When they're fully solid, they're vulnerable to our weapons. When they're phased, they can't attack effectively. Finally, they heard the sound of the shuttle's engines. The pilot brought the craft down in a hover just above the rocky outcrop. The next morning, Captain Jake Morrison called a meeting in the ship's main conference room. Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez sat with his arm in a sling, while Private Johnson walked with a slight limp. Dr. Richard Hayes had spent the entire night studying the shadow maw samples, and his eyes were red from lack of sleep. "Let's talk about what happened yesterday," Jake said, looking around the table. "We encountered the creatures that have kept the Zephyrians underground for thousands of years." "What did we learn?" Carlos spoke first. "Sir, the shadow maws are dangerous, but they're not impossible to fight. They're smart and they work together, but they can be hurt by our weapons when they're in solid form." Amy Watson nodded in agreement. "They seemed more curious about us than truly aggressive, like they were testing us instead of trying to kill us immediately." Dr. Hayes looked up from his tablet. "I've been analyzing the tissue samples all night. These creatures are fascinating from a biological perspective. Their ability to phase through matter comes from a unique cellular structure that can shift between different energy states. It's unlike anything we've seen before." Commander Steve Johnson entered the room and sat down heavily. Steve was Jake's second in command, a practical man who had served in the military for 20 years. He looked tired and concerned. "Captain, I've been thinking about our mission here," Steve said. "We came to establish diplomatic relations with the Zephyrians, but how can we do that when they're trapped underground by fear?" Jake leaned back in his chair. "What are you suggesting, Commander?" "I think we should help them," Steve replied. "The Zephyrians are peaceful, intelligent people. They have technology and knowledge that could benefit both our species, but they can't move forward as long as they're hiding from these predators." Dr. Susan Clark, the ship's behavioral scientist, had been quiet during the meeting. Now she looked up with interest. "Commander Johnson, what exactly do you have in mind?" Steve stood up and walked to the large screen on the wall. "I'm suggesting we hunt the shadow maws. Not to wipe them out completely, but to reduce their numbers and show the Zephyrians that these creatures can be defeated." The room went silent. Everyone stared at Steve as if he had suggested something impossible. Carlos was the first to speak. "Sir, with respect, that sounds extremely dangerous. We barely survived one encounter with 3 of them." "But we did survive," Steve pointed out. "And we learned from that encounter. Dr. Hayes, what can you tell us about their behavior patterns?" Dr. Hayes consulted his notes. "Based on yesterday's encounter in the Zephyrian data, the shadow maws are territorial. They hunt in small packs, usually 3 to 5 individuals. They're most active during the planet's twilight hours, which last about 3 Earth hours each day." Dr. Clark leaned forward with growing excitement. "Commander Johnson might be right. I've been studying predator behavior for years. The shadow maws we encountered yesterday showed classic hunting patterns. They're intelligent, but they're also predictable if you understand their psychology." Amy raised her hand. "What do you mean, predictable?" "Think about it," Dr. Clark explained. "They've been the apex predators on this planet for thousands of years. No creature has ever successfully fought back against them. They're overconfident. They probably think they're invincible." Lieutenant Paul Wright, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "That overconfidence could be their weakness. If we can catch them off guard, use tactics they've never seen before, we might have a real chance." Jake looked around the room at his crew. He could see they were all thinking about the same thing. These people had volunteered for a dangerous mission to the stars. They weren't the type to back down from a challenge. "Dr. Clark, how would you approach hunting these creatures?" Jake asked. Susan stood up and walked to the screen. First, we need to understand their territory. The Shadow Maws probably have established hunting grounds. We find those areas and set up observations. Then we study their patrol patterns and identify when they're most vulnerable. Carlos shifted in his chair, his wounded shoulder reminding him of the danger. Even if we understand their patterns, we still need better weapons. Our standard rifles barely scratch them. Dr. Hayes looked up with excitement. I might have something that could help. The tissue analysis shows that their phasing ability requires a lot of energy. If we could disrupt that energy somehow, force them to stay solid, they'd be much more vulnerable. How do we do that? Paul asked. Electromagnetic pulses, Dr. Hayes replied. Their cellular structure uses bioelectric fields to shift between states. A focused EMP blast might lock them in solid form long enough for conventional weapons to be effective. Steve nodded approvingly. That's good thinking, Doctor. Can we modify our equipment to produce those pulses? I believe so, Dr. Hayes said. Give me a few days to work on it. Jake made his decision. All right, we'll try it. But this is going to be dangerous, and it's not part of our original mission. Anyone who doesn't want to participate can stay. On the ship with no judgment, no one moved. Every person in the room was looking at him with determination. Good, Jake said. Commander Johnson, you'll lead the planning. Dr. Clark, I want detailed behavioral analysis. Dr. Hayes, work on those electromagnetic weapons. We'll take our time and do this right. Over the next 3 days, the humans prepared for their hunting expedition. Dr. Hayes worked around the clock to modify their weapons. He created small devices that could produce focused electromagnetic pulses. The devices were about the size of a grenade and could be thrown or launched from their rifles. Dr. Clark studied every piece of data they had about Shadow Maw behavior. She mapped out probable hunting territories and identified the most likely locations for an encounter. Her analysis suggested that a particular valley about 10 miles from their landing site would be perfect for their purposes. Meanwhile, Commander Johnson planned their tactics. He studied the forest terrain and developed strategies that would give the humans every possible advantage. They would use the Shadow Maw's overconfidence against them. Carlos spent his time recovering from his injuries and training the other Marines in new combat techniques. Despite his wounded shoulder, he insisted on being part of the hunting party. On the 4th day, they were ready. The hunting team consisted of Commander Johnson, Sergeant Rodriguez, Lieutenant Wright, Privates Watson and Lee, and Dr. Clark. Dr. Hayes would monitor from the shuttle, ready to provide support if needed. The team landed in the valley that Dr. Clark had identified. It was a beautiful place with a small river running through it and plenty of large trees for cover. More importantly, it showed clear signs of Shadow Maw activity. Large claw marks scored the tree trunks, and the ground was marked with their distinctive six-toed footprints. Remember the plan? Commander Johnson said quietly. We set up in a triangle formation with good sight lines. When the Shadow Maws appear, we use the EMP devices first to force them solid, then concentrate our fire on one target at a time. Amy checked her equipment nervously. The modified rifle felt heavier than usual with the EMP launcher attached underneath. Commander, what if there are more than 3 of them? Then we retreat to the shuttle, Johnson replied. This is about proving they can be defeated, not about being heroes. They didn't have to wait long. As the planet's sun began to set and the twilight period started, the Shadow Maws appeared. 3 of them emerged from the forest like living shadows. They moved with the lazy confidence of creatures that had never known defeat. When they saw the humans, they paused with what seemed like amusement rather than caution. Steady, Johnson whispered into his radio. Wait for my signal. The largest Shadow Maw stepped forward. It was even bigger than the ones they had encountered before, probably the pack leader. Its red eyes glowed in the dim light as it studied the humans. Amy could see intelligence in those eyes, but also arrogance. The creature took another step forward, and Amy realized it was toying with them. It thought the humans were helpless prey, just like the Zephyrians. Now, Johnson shouted. 6 EMP devices flew through the air and exploded around the shadow maws with bright flashes of light. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The creatures' forms solidified completely, and they stumbled as if suddenly dizzy. "Fire!" Johnson ordered. The humans opened fire with everything they had. Without their phasing ability, the shadow maws were vulnerable. The pack leader roared in pain and surprise as bullets tore into its armored hide. It had never been truly hurt before. The other two shadow maws tried to phase away, but the MP effects were still disrupting their abilities. One of them managed to become partially transparent, but Carlos's shot still found its mark. The pack leader charged toward Commander Johnson with a roar of rage. Johnson rolled aside and fired his rifle at point-blank range. The creature stumbled and fell, dark blood pooling beneath it. Within minutes, it was over. One shadow maw was dead, and the other two had fled into the forest, wounded and confused. For the first time in thousands of years, apex predators had been defeated on this planet. Amy stared at the fallen creature in amazement. "We actually did it. We killed a shadow maw." Dr. Clark was already taking readings with her instruments. "Look at this." The electromagnetic disruption not only forced them solid, it also seemed to disorient them. They lost their coordination and tactical awareness. The news of the successful shadow maw hunt spread through the human ship like wildfire. Everyone wanted to see the massive creature that the away team had brought back. The dead shadow maw was stored in the ship's cargo bay, where Dr. Richard Hayes began his detailed examination. Captain Jake Morrison was pleased with the mission's success, but he was more interested in how the Zephyrians would react. He called Counselor Veltar on the communication system and asked for an urgent meeting. "Counselor, we have something important to show your people," Jake said through the translator. "We have proof that the shadow maws can be defeated." The response from the underground city was immediate and intense. Within an hour, a large group of Zephyrians emerged from their tunnels for the first time in decades. Veltar led them, his crystal antlers glowing brighter than usual with excitement and nervousness. The Zephyrians gathered around the shuttle that had brought the shadow maw body. When the cargo doors opened and they saw the massive dead creature, the reaction was extraordinary. Some of the aliens fell to their knees. Others backed away in fear, even though the beast was clearly dead. A few of the younger Zephyrians stepped closer, their eyes wide with amazement. "Impossible," Veltar whispered, his voice barely audible. Through the translator, "No creature has ever killed a shadow maw. How did you do this?" Commander Steve Johnson explained their hunting strategy, the electromagnetic weapons, and the tactical approach they had used. The Zephyrians listened with growing wonder, but Jake could see they were still having trouble believing what they were seeing. "The important thing," Jake told Veltar, "is that these creatures are not invincible. They can be hunted and defeated with the right knowledge and equipment." Dr. Susan Clark added, "Your people have been hiding from predators that are actually quite predictable. With proper training and weapons, you could reclaim your surface world." But while the diplomats and scientists were discussing the implications of the hunt, something else was happening in the ship's galley. Chef Danny Kim was having a very different conversation with Dr. Hayes. "Doctor, I need to ask you about the shadow maw specimen," Danny said, leaning against the laboratory door. Dr. Hayes looked up from his microscope. "What about it, Danny?" "Well, I've been thinking about the protein analysis you did. The missile density readings were very impressive. I was wondering if you could spare a small sample for culinary analysis?" Dr. Hayes stared at him. "Culinary analysis?" "Danny, you're talking about the apex predator that has terrorized an entire civilization for thousands of years." Danny shrugged. "Every species we've encountered in space has been edible with proper preparation. The shadow maw is just another animal when you get down to it. A very large, very muscular animal with what looks like excellent marbling in the tissue." "You want to cook it?" Dr. Hayes said slowly. "I want to see if it can be cooked," Danny corrected. "There's a difference. This is scientific curiosity, just like your biological research." Dr. Hayes considered this for a moment. He had to admit that Danny had a point. They had eaten alien creatures on every planet they had visited. Why should this one be different just because the locals were afraid of it? I suppose I could spare a small sample, Dr. Hayes said finally. But you need to be very careful. We don't know if the meat is safe for human consumption. Danny's eyes lit up. Doc, I've been cooking alien protein for 3 years. I know how to test for safety. Besides, if it's toxic, we'll find out real quick. 2 hours later, Danny was in his kitchen examining a piece of shadow maw muscle tissue. It was dark red, almost black, with a texture unlike anything he had worked with before. The meat was incredibly dense, with what looked like natural marbling that reminded him of the finest beef on Earth. He started with small tests, checking for obvious toxins and analyzing the protein structure. Everything looked normal, just more concentrated than usual. The muscle fibers were packed with nutrients and what appeared to be natural flavor compounds. Interesting, Danny muttered to himself as he prepared a tiny sample for cooking. Very interesting indeed. Meanwhile, on the planet's surface, the meeting between humans and Zephyrians was continuing. More aliens had emerged from the underground city, and they were all staring at the dead shadow maw with mixtures of fear and fascination. Young Zephyrians, who had never seen the surface before, were asking questions about the hunt. They wanted to know how the humans had been brave enough to face such a terrible creature. The older Zephyrians seemed torn between admiration and concern. Your people must be the greatest warriors in the galaxy, one young Zephyrian said to Amy Watson, to hunt the shadow demons and win. Amy laughed. We're not warriors. Well, some of us are soldiers, but we're mostly just explorers and scientists. We faced the shadow maws because someone needed to prove they could be beaten. Dr. Kate Morgan, the ship's cultural anthropologist, was documenting the Zephyrians' reactions. She found their response fascinating from a sociological perspective. These people had built their entire culture around avoiding predators, and now they were seeing those same predators defeated by outsiders. Counselor Veltar, Kate said, how do you think your people will react to this news? Veltar's antlers dimmed as he considered the question. I do not know, Dr. Morgan. For thousands of years, we have taught our children that the shadow maws are invincible forces of nature. Now you show us that they are merely animals that can be hunted and killed. This will change everything. Back on the ship, Danny Kim was making culinary history. His first small taste test had gone well. The shadow maw meat was safe for human consumption and had a rich, complex flavor unlike anything he had experienced before. It was like the finest game meat, but with depth and intensity that was almost overwhelming. This is incredible, he said to himself, already planning how to prepare a larger portion. The flavor profile is amazing. It's like what beef would taste like if cows were made of pure muscle and lived on a diet of lightning. Danny decided to prepare the shadow maw using a combination of earth techniques and methods he had learned from cooking other alien creatures. He would season it simply to let the natural flavors come through, then cook it slowly to tenderize. The incredibly dense muscle fibers as Danny worked in his kitchen. He was unaware that his cooking was about to create the biggest diplomatic incident in human history. Dr. Hayes came to check on the cooking process an hour later. The smell coming from the galley was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was rich and savory, with hints of something wild and primal. How's it going, Danny? Dr. Hayes asked. Danny looked up from his work, his eyes bright with excitement. Doc, this is the most amazing protein I've ever worked with. The flavor development is incredible. I've got enough here for about 6 people to try it. You're really going to serve shadow maw meat for dinner? Dr. Hayes asked. Why not? Danny replied. We've eaten worse things on this mission. Remember those slug creatures from the swamp planet? At least this tastes good. News of Danny's cooking project spread through the ship quickly. Some crew members were horrified, others were curious, and a few were genuinely excited about tasting apex predator. Captain Morrison heard about it from Lieutenant Wright, who mentioned it casually during their evening briefing. Sir, I thought... You should know that Chef Kim is preparing shadow maw steaks for dinner tonight. Jake stared at him. He's doing what? Cooking the shadow maw, sir. Dr. Hayes gave him a sample for culinary testing. Jake felt a headache coming on. Please tell me the Zephyrians don't know about this. Well, sir, that might be a problem. Counselor Veltar and several other Zephyrians are planning to have dinner with us tonight as part of the cultural exchange program. Jake closed his eyes and took a deep breath. In all his years of diplomatic service, he had never faced a situation quite like this. How do you explain to a species that has lived in terror of a creature for thousands of years that your chef has decided to serve it for dinner? Get me Chef Kim, Jake said finally. We need to have a serious conversation. But when Jake arrived at the galley, he found Danny putting the finishing touches on what looked like a magnificent feast. The Shadow Maw steaks were perfectly cooked, seasoned with herbs from 3 different planets and arranged on plates like they belonged in the finest restaurant in the galaxy. Captain, Danny said cheerfully, perfect timing. I was just about to send these up to the dining room. Wait until you taste this. It's the best meat I've ever cooked. Jake looked at the beautifully prepared steaks and realized there was no turning back now. The Zephyrians were expecting dinner with their new human friends. Danny had created what was probably a culinary masterpiece, and Jake was about to serve the nightmares of an entire civilization as the main course. Danny, Jake said slowly, I hope you know what you've done. Danny smiled and picked up the first plate. Captain, I've made dinner. What could go wrong? As they carried the Shadow Maw steaks toward the dining room where the Zephyrians were waiting, Jake couldn't help but think that this was either going to be the most successful cultural exchange in human history, or the most spectacular diplomatic disaster ever recorded. The dining room doors opened, and Counselor Veltar looked up expectantly, his crystal antlers glowing with friendly anticipation. The dining room of the Horizon's Edge had never hosted a more important meal. Captain Jake Morrison sat at the head of the long table, with Counselor Veltar and 5 other Zephyrians seated along one side. The aliens' crystal antlers glowed softly in the room's warm lighting, creating beautiful patterns on the walls. Dr. Lisa Baker, Dr. Kate Morgan, Commander Steve Johnson, and several other human crew members filled the remaining seats. Everyone was dressed in their best uniforms for this historic dinner. The Zephyrians wore ceremonial robes that shimmered with the same colors as their antlers. We are honored to share this meal with our new friends from Earth, Veltar said through the translation device. This is the first time in 300 years that Zephyrians have dined on the surface of our world. Jake smiled and nodded, trying to hide his nervousness. Through the dining room's large windows, he could see the alien sunset painting the sky in brilliant purples and oranges. It was beautiful, but all Jake could think about was what Chef Danny Kim was preparing in the kitchen. The honor is ours, Counselor, Jake replied. We hope this dinner will be the beginning of a long friendship between our peoples. A young Zephyrian named Kethver leaned forward with excitement. Captain Morrison, we would love to learn more about human culture. What foods do your people enjoy? Jake felt his stomach tighten. Well, humans eat many different things. We have foods from plants, fruits, grains, and... He paused, looking for the right words. And various proteins. The Zephyrians nodded politely, though Jake could see they were still uncomfortable with the idea of eating meat. Their species had evolved as pure herbivores, and the concept of consuming other creatures remained foreign to them. At that moment, the dining room doors opened. Chef Danny Kim entered carrying a large serving tray, followed by 2 crew members with additional dishes. Danny's face was bright with pride and excitement. He had no idea of the cultural storm he was about to unleash. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored guests, Danny announced cheerfully. Tonight we have a very special meal prepared with ingredients from your beautiful planet. Jake watched in fascination and horror as Danny began setting plates in front of each diner. The Shadow Maw steaks looked magnificent. They were perfectly cooked with a rich brown crust and pink center. The meat was garnished with colorful vegetables and herbs that Danny had grown in the ship's garden. The Zephyrians looked at their plates with polite curiosity. They had never seen cooked meat before, so they didn't immediately recognize what they were looking at. The steaks looked like some kind of elaborate plant-based dish to their inexperienced eyes. Chef Kim, Dr. Morgan asked carefully, would you mind telling our guests what you've prepared? Danny beamed with pride. Of course. Tonight's main course is slow-roasted shadowmaw tenderloin, seasoned with native herbs and served with a reduction sauce made from local berries. The translation device worked perfectly, converting Danny's words into the musical language of the Zephyrians. For a moment, there was complete silence in the dining room. Then Veltar made a sound that the translator couldn't convert. It was somewhere between a gasp and a musical note of pure shock. His crystal antlers began flashing rapidly between different colors. Shadowmaw? Veltar whispered, staring at his plate. You have prepared the shadow demon ... for consumption? Danny nodded enthusiastically, completely missing the counselor's tone of horror. Yes, the protein structure was amazing to work with. I've never cooked anything quite like it. The flavor development was incredible. The other Zephyrians were now staring at their plates as if they contained poison. One of them, a female named Salandra, began making high-pitched musical sounds that the translator identified as distress calls. Amy Watson, who was seated next to young Kethvar, noticed that the Zephyrian was trembling. His antlers had dimmed to almost nothing, and his large eyes were fixed on the meat with absolute terror. It's okay, Amy said gently. You don't have to eat it if you don't want to. But Kethvar wasn't listening. He was staring at the humans around the table who had already begun cutting into their steaks. Captain Morrison had taken a bite and was chewing thoughtfully. The flavor is quite remarkable, Jake said to Danny, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Rich and complex. Well done, Chef. Commander Johnson nodded in agreement. This is excellent, Danny. The texture is perfect. Dr. Hayes, who had been curious about the taste since his biological analysis, cut a large piece and ate it with obvious enjoyment. The protein content must be incredible. I can see why this creature was such an effective predator. The Zephyrians watched this casual consumption of their greatest fear with expressions of absolute amazement. To them, it was as if the humans were casually eating pieces of death itself. Veltar finally found his voice. You ... You are consuming the shadow demon, the creature that has haunted our people for thousands of years. And you speak of it as if it were ... ordinary food? Dr. Morgan realized they were in the middle of a major cultural crisis. She set down her fork and looked at the Zephyrians with understanding. Counselor Veltar, I think there's been a misunderstanding about human culture, she said carefully. For humans, eating the creatures we hunt is a sign of respect. We don't waste any part of an animal we've killed. But this explanation only seemed to make things worse. Salandra stood up from the table so quickly that she knocked over her chair. Respect? She said, her voice high and musical with disbelief. You show respect to the shadow demons by consuming their flesh. Private Watson tried to help. It's not disrespectful. It's just ... practical. On Earth, humans have always eaten the animals we hunt. It's completely normal for us. Young Kethvar was staring at Amy with a mixture of awe and terror. You speak of consuming shadow demons as if it were normal. What manner of creatures are you humans? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jake realized this was a pivotal moment in human-Zephyrian relations. How he answered could determine whether they became allies or whether the Zephyrians would forever view humans as something to be feared. Before Jake could respond, Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez spoke up. Despite his injured shoulder, Carlos had insisted on attending the dinner. He looked directly at Veltar as he cut another piece of his steak. Counselor, your people have lived in fear of these creatures for thousands of years, Carlos said quietly. But they're just animals? Dangerous animals, yes, but still just flesh and blood. By eating them, we're proving they have no power over us. Dr. Clark added, in human culture, consuming a defeated enemy can be seen as claiming their strength. It's a way of showing that we're not afraid. The Zephyrians exchanged rapid musical conversations among themselves. Jake could see they were struggling to understand this completely alien concept. Finally, Veltar spoke again. So when you consume the shadow demon, you are not showing fear or worship. You are demonstrating dominance. Exactly, Jake said. We're showing that we see them as just another source of food, not as supernatural monsters. Danny Kim, who had been quietly listening to this exchange, suddenly understood the magnitude of what his cooking had revealed. "I'm sorry if I upset anyone," he said. "I was just curious about how it would taste." Kethfer looked at Danny with wonder. "You cook the shadow demon because of curiosity? Not as a ritual of power or dominance, but simply to discover its flavor?" "Well, yes," Danny replied. "It's what I do. I'm a chef. I cook things." This simple statement seemed to break something in the Zephyrians' understanding. They had been prepared to accept humans as great warriors or powerful beings. But the idea that someone would casually cook their apex predator out of simple professional curiosity was beyond their comprehension. Salandra slowly sat back down, her antlers beginning to glow again. "You truly do not fear the shadow demons at all," Amy laughed. "Fear them? They're just big animals with some interesting abilities. Sergeant Rodriguez and his team prove they can be beaten. Chef Kim proved they can be eaten. What's to fear?" Over. The next hour, the Zephyrians watched in amazement as the humans finished their meals. The crew members discussed the flavor, compared it to other foods they had tried, and several asked Danny if he could prepare Shadow Maw again using different cooking methods. The casual way the humans treated their former apex predator was revolutionary for the Zephyrians. They began asking questions about human hunting practices, food preparation, and the psychology of fear. By the end of the dinner, 3 young Zephyrians had asked if they could learn human hunting techniques. They wanted to face their fears and reclaim their world's surface. Veltar stood as the meal concluded. His antlers were now glowing brighter than they had all evening. "Captain Morrison," he said formally, "my people have a request. We would like some of your crew to remain on our world permanently. We want to learn not just your hunting methods, but your way of thinking, your ability to turn terror into dinner." Jake smiled and stood as well. "We would be honored to help, Counselor. And I promise you, Chef Kim will teach your people many new ways to prepare Shadow Maw." As the Zephyrians left that night, they carried with them something their species hadn't felt in thousands of years: hope. The shadow demons that had kept them underground were no longer unstoppable forces of nature.